The air in the room was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and the faint metallic tang of Joseph's latest concrete sculpture sitting on the dining table. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of their 20th anniversary celebration, a raw, jagged piece he called Fractured Time. But now it felt like a mistake. Isabella's laughter cut through the chatter of their guests like a knife, sharp and deliberate. "Joseph, really?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery as she gestured toward the sculpture. "I told you not to bring this thing. It's embarrassing. It looks like something you'd find in a dumpster." She turned to their friends, her designer handbag dangling precariously off her chair, and smirked. "He's been at this for years, and this is what he comes up with. Pathetic, isn't it?" Joseph felt his stomach drop. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as all eyes turned to him. He clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. The sculpture wasn't just a piece of art to him. It was a part of him, a reflection of the hours he'd spent pouring his soul into something tangible. But now, under Isabella's scornful gaze, it felt like a joke. He glanced at the family photo on the mantel, taken years ago when things were simpler. Ethan was just a toddler then, and Isabella's smile had been genuine, not the cold, calculated smirk she wore now. He wondered when it had all changed, when had her compliments turned to criticism, her encouragement to contempt. "It's not about the sculpture," she continued, her voice loud enough to carry across the room. "It's about the effort, or lack thereof. You'd think after 2 decades, he'd have figured it out by now." Joseph's jaw tightened. He wanted to scream, to tell her how much those words stung, but he stayed silent. He'd learned long ago that arguing with Isabella only made things worse. Instead, he forced a tight smile and muttered something about needing more wine, pushing his chair back with a scrape that echoed through the room. As he stood, he caught Ethan's eye. His son looked torn, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Joseph gave him a small nod, a silent reassurance that he was fine, even though he wasn't. He wasn't sure he'd been fine in years. In the kitchen, Joseph leaned against the counter, his hands trembling. He could still hear Isabella's laughter, the way it echoed in his mind like a broken record. The sculpture sat in the dining room, a silent witness to his humiliation. He thought about smashing it, about letting the concrete shatter into a million pieces, just like his pride. But he didn't. Instead, he poured himself another glass of wine and stared out the window, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a stone. He'd always known Isabella could be cruel, but tonight felt different. It wasn't just the mockery. It was the way she'd done it in front of everyone, as if she wanted them all to see how little she thought of him. And maybe they did. Maybe they'd been laughing at him all along, just like she was. Joseph took a long sip of wine, the bitterness lingering on his tongue. He thought about the years he'd spent trying to please her, trying to make her proud. But nothing was ever enough. Not his art, not his job, not even the life they'd built together. It was like he was trapped in a loop, constantly chasing her approval but never quite reaching it. As he stood there, the sound of laughter drifting in from the dining room, Joseph made a silent vow. He wouldn't let her break him. Not this time. He didn't know how yet, but he knew one thing for sure. Things couldn't stay like this. He just didn't realize how bad they were about to get. The air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of burnt garlic bread from dinner, a failed attempt at normalcy. Joseph stood at the sink, scrubbing a plate that didn't need scrubbing, his knuckles white against the porcelain. He could still hear the echo of Isabella's laughter from earlier, sharp and cutting, as she dismissed his sculptures as pathetic attempts at art. His hands trembled slightly, and he set the plate down, staring at the sudsy water as if it held answers. That's when Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" Joseph dried his hands on a dish towel, the fabric rough against his skin, and followed Ethan into the living room. The TV was on in the background, some reality show where people screamed at each other over trivial things. Ethan grabbed the remote and muted it, then sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows on his knees. Joseph sank into the armchair across from him, the leather creaking under his weight. "What's going on, Ethan?" Joseph asked, though he already felt a knot tightening in his stomach. Ethan glanced toward the hallway, as if checking to make sure Isabella wasn't within earshot. "It's Mom," he said finally, his voice cracking. "I've seen her meeting with Mark. Late at night. She says it's for project meetings. But—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the floor. Joseph felt the room tilt slightly, the edges of his vision blurring. Mark, Isabella's colleague. The guy with the expensive suits and the too-perfect smile. Joseph had met him once at a company holiday party, and even then he'd felt a strange unease, though he couldn't put his finger on why. "How late?" Joseph asked, his voice low and steady, though his chest felt like it was caving in. "Past midnight," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "A few times a week. She thinks I don't notice, but—" He looked up, his eyes glassy. "Dad, I don't think it's just work." Joseph's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the past few months. Isabella's sudden interest in late-night work calls. Her constant texting, the way she'd started dressing differently, wearing perfume even when she wasn't going anywhere special. He'd dismissed it all, chalking it up to stress or a midlife crisis. But now, with Ethan's words hanging in the air, it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. A half-empty wine glass sat on the coffee table, the remnants of Isabella's nightly ritual. Joseph stared at it, the deep red liquid catching the light, and felt a surge of anger so sharp it nearly took his breath away. How long had she been lying to him? How long had he been blind to the signs? Ethan's phone buzzed on the couch beside him, the screen lighting up with a late-night notification. Joseph's eyes flicked to it, then back to Ethan, who quickly silenced it. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know if I should say anything, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." Joseph reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "Thank you for telling me." Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping with relief, but Joseph could see the guilt etched into his face. He hated that his son had been burdened with this, that he'd had to carry the weight of Isabella's secrets. As they sat there in silence, the muted TV casting flickering shadows across the room, Joseph felt a strange clarity settle over him. He'd spent years ignoring the cracks in his marriage, convincing himself that things would get better, that Isabella's sharp words and cold indifference were just phases. But now, with Ethan's revelation, he couldn't pretend anymore. He glanced at the hallway again, where the faint sound of Isabella's laughter drifted from the bedroom, and felt a cold, hard resolve take root in his chest. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to keep looking the other way. The wine glass on the table caught his eye again, and this time he reached for it, his fingers tightening around the stem. He held it up, the liquid sloshing slightly, then set it down with a quiet clink. He wouldn't break it. Not yet. But he would break something. The house was unnaturally quiet that night, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Isabella had left earlier, claiming another late-night project meeting with Mark. Joseph sat at her desk, his fingers tracing the edge of the locked drawer he'd never thought to open before. The key had been tucked under a stack of old receipts in her jewelry box, a place she probably thought he'd never look. His hands trembled as he slid it into the lock, the click echoing louder than it should have. Inside, the drawer was a mess, bank statements, crumpled papers, and a single, pristine envelope with Mark's name scrawled across it. Joseph's stomach churned as he pulled out the documents. The numbers leaped off the page. $15,000 withdrawn over the past 6 months, transfers to an account he didn't recognize, and a grant application stamped with Mark's company logo. The grant was for $50,000. Approved and signed by Isabella, with no mention of it ever making its way into their shared accounts. He stared at the crumpled grant application, the edges frayed as if it had been shoved into the drawer in a hurry. The words blurred as he read them. Funding for innovative art projects. His concrete sculptures came to mind, the ones she'd mocked so publicly. The irony was bitter. She'd called his work worthless while secretly funneling money into something or someone else. Joseph's jaw tightened as he pieced it together. The late nights, the texts she'd quickly swipe away, the way she'd started dressing up for work even on casual Fridays. It wasn't just the money. It was the lies, the double life she'd been living right under his nose. He thought of Ethan, his son's worried face when he'd mentioned Mark. How long had Isabella been playing them all for fools? His fingers clenched around the papers, crumpling them further. The anger was there, simmering, but it was the betrayal that cut deeper. He'd trusted her. They'd built a life together, or so he'd thought. But this was something else entirely. A locked drawer full of secrets, a bank account drained, a grant for a man who wasn't her husband. Joseph leaned back in the chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The room felt colder suddenly, the air heavy with the scent of her expensive perfume, now sickly sweet to him. He thought of the sculptures in his workshop, the ones she'd belittled. They were his passion, his escape. And now, with the evidence spread out before him, he realized how much of himself he'd sacrificed for her. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. The papers went into a folder, the folder into his bag. He'd need copies, proof, something tangible to hold on to. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival. About protecting what little was left of the life they'd built, or the life he'd thought they'd built. As he locked the drawer and slid the key back into place, a quiet resolve settled over him. He wasn't the man she'd mocked at that party. He wasn't the fool she'd taken him for. He was Joseph, the sculptor, the provider, the father. And if she thought she could take everything from him without a fight, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The living room felt like a mausoleum that night, the kind of place where warmth went to die. The cold, sterile glow of the overhead light bounced off the marble floor, casting sharp shadows that seemed to cut through the room. Joseph stood in the center of it all, the stack of bank statements trembling in his hand. The numbers on the pages didn't lie. $15,000 withdrawn over the past 6 months, all tied to an account he'd never heard of. And then there was the grant from Mark, her so-called colleague. A grant she'd never mentioned, not once. Isabella sat on the edge of the couch, legs crossed, her designer heels glinting under the light. She was scrolling through her phone, her face a mask of disinterest. Like this was just another mundane Thursday. Joseph cleared his throat, the sound sharp and brittle in the silence. "Isabella," he said, his voice low but steady, "we need to talk about this." She didn't look up. "About what?" He stepped closer, the papers rustling as he held them out. "This, the withdrawals, the grant. What the hell is going on?" Finally, she glanced up, her eyes narrowing as she took in the documents. For a moment, there was nothing. No guilt, no surprise, not even a flicker of discomfort. Then she laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh, not the kind they used to share over inside jokes or stupid TV shows. This was sharp, dismissive, almost cruel. "Oh, Joseph," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You're being paranoid again. Always looking for problems where there aren't any." His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "Paranoid? You've been sneaking around, taking money out of our account, and now you're saying I'm paranoid? What about Mark? What about these late-night project meetings?" She leaned back, her smug smile widening. "Mark is a colleague, a friend. We've been working on something big, something that could have been a huge opportunity for us. But now, thanks to your little investigation, I'm not sure that's even possible." Joseph's chest tightened. Her words were sharp, calculated, designed to make him doubt himself. He could feel the anger bubbling up, hot and raw, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Opportunity? What kind of opportunity requires you to lie to me? To take money without telling me?" She rolled her eyes, the movement exaggerated, almost theatrical. "It's not a lie if you don't understand. You've always been so small-minded, Joseph. So focused on your little sculptures and your little world. Not everything revolves around you." The words hit like a slap. Small-minded. Little. He'd heard it before in passing comments and offhand remarks, but never like this, never so direct, so cutting. He took a step back, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice cracking under the strain. "You've been lying to me, taking money, and now you're just going to turn it around like it's my fault?" She stood then, smoothing her skirt with a practiced elegance. "I'm not turning anything around. You're the one who's making this into a big deal. If you just trusted me, if you just let me handle things, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Joseph stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to yell, to demand the truth, but something in her demeanor stopped him. She was too calm, too collected, like she'd already won. And maybe she had. Maybe this was how it had always been. Her pulling the strings, him stumbling along, too blind to see the cracks until they were gaping holes. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. He glanced at the bank statements in his hand, the numbers blurring as his vision swam. He didn't know what to say, how to fight back against someone who refused to even acknowledge the fight. Isabella walked past him, her heels clicking against the floor, and paused at the doorway. "You should really let this go, Joseph," she said, her voice soft but firm. "For your own sake." And then she was gone, leaving him alone in the cold, sterile light, the papers still clenched in his fists. The workshop smelled like wet concrete and mildew, a scent Joseph once found comforting. Now, it just reminded him of how long it had been since he'd finished anything. He sat on the stool, his back hunched, staring at the half-formed figure in front of him. It was supposed to be a man reaching for the sky, but the arms had cracked during curing, and the torso sagged slightly to one side. A failure just like everything else lately. His tools were scattered across the workbench, coated in a fine layer of dust. He hadn't touched them in weeks. Not since the party. Not since Isabella had laughed in front of everyone, her voice sharp and mocking, calling his sculptures pathetic. The memory still burned, but it wasn't the only thing that kept him awake at night. It was the way Ethan had looked at him afterward. Pity in his son's eyes, like he'd known something Joseph hadn't. The faded wedding photo on the wall caught his eye. It was crooked, the glass smudged with fingerprints. He didn't remember the last time he'd straightened it. In the picture, Isabella was smiling, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He looked happy, or maybe he just looked young. Back then, he'd believed in things like forever, like partnership, like love. Now, he couldn't even remember the last time she'd touched him without it feeling like an obligation. He ran a finger along the edge of the cracked sculpture. The concrete was rough, unfinished, just like his marriage. How had he not seen it before? The late nights she spent working, the way she'd started dressing up more, the way she'd started laughing less. At least when he was around. He'd chalked it up to stress, to the demands of her career. He'd made excuses for her, just like he'd made excuses for himself. The workshop was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. He thought about the nights he'd spent out here, working on his sculptures while she was inside, scrolling through her phone or watching some reality show. He told himself it was fine, that they were just in a rut, that every marriage had its ups and downs. But now, sitting here in the silence, he couldn't ignore the truth. She hadn't just stopped caring about his art. She'd stopped caring about him. He picked up a chisel, turning it over in his hands. The weight felt familiar, comforting. For years, he'd poured his heart into these sculptures, thinking they were his legacy. But what good was a legacy if no one cared? What good was a marriage if it left you feeling emptier than before? The cracked sculpture stared back at him, its broken arms reaching for something it would never touch. It was a mirror, he realized. A mirror of everything he'd been trying to hold on to. The marriage, the dreams, the belief that someday, things would get better. But they hadn't, and maybe they never would. He stood up, his legs stiff from sitting too long. The workshop felt smaller than it used to, the walls closing in on him. He reached for the wedding photo, his fingers brushing the dusty glass. For a moment, he thought about taking it down, about smashing it against the floor. But he didn't. Instead, he straightened it, wiping the smudges away with his sleeve. The sculpture would never be finished. He knew that now. But maybe, just maybe, he could be. The workshop smelled of damp concrete and sawdust, a scent that usually grounded Joseph, but tonight it felt suffocating. He sat on his stool, staring at the lawyer's business card propped against a half-finished sculpture. The card was pristine, the embossed letters catching the dim light. It had taken him 3 days to work up the courage to call. 3 days of pacing, of rehearsing what he'd say, of wondering if he was overreacting. But the stack of printed emails on the workbench told him otherwise. He'd started small, digging through old receipts and bank statements. Isabella had always been meticulous with her finances, or so he thought. The first red flag was a series of withdrawals labeled project expenses. He'd asked her about it once, casually, over dinner. She'd waved him off, saying it was for a work conference. But the amounts didn't add up. A conference didn't cost thousands of dollars, and it certainly didn't involve late-night dinners at expensive restaurants with Mark. The emails were worse. He'd found them on her laptop, left open one night when she'd stormed out after another argument. They were filled with flirtatious banter, plans for secret meetups, and references to things they'd done together that made Joseph's stomach churn. He'd printed them all, his hands shaking as he fed the pages into the printer. Each one felt like a punch to the gut, but he forced himself to keep going. He needed proof not just for the lawyer but for himself. He needed to see it all laid out, undeniable and irrefutable. The secure USB drive sat next to the emails, a tiny black rectangle that held the digital evidence of Isabella's betrayal. He'd copied everything: bank statements, text messages, photos. Felt invasive, almost dirty, but he didn't care anymore. She'd made her choices, and now he was making his. The lawyer had been calm and professional, her voice steady as she outlined the steps they'd need to take. Joseph had listened, nodding along, but his mind kept drifting back to the workshop, to the sculptures he'd poured his heart into. Isabella had called them pathetic attempts at art, but they were more than that to him. They were his legacy, something tangible he could leave behind. And now, with the possibility of divorce looming, he realized he needed to protect them too. He'd started moving them to a storage unit, one piece at a time, under the guise of clearing space. Isabella hadn't noticed, or if she had, she didn't care. She was too caught up in her own world, her own lies. Joseph wondered if she even saw him anymore, or if he'd become just another piece of furniture in their crumbling marriage. As he sat there, staring at the lawyer's card, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. This wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about survival. He'd spent years bending to Isabella's will, sacrificing his own happiness to keep the peace. But no more. He was done being the quiet, accommodating husband. He was done being made to feel small. He picked up the USB drive, turning it over in his hands. It was heavy with the weight of everything it contained, but it also felt like a lifeline. This was his way out, his chance to start over. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time he felt like he had control. And that was enough. The workshop was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead light. Joseph took a deep breath, letting the familiar smells and sounds steady him. Then he stood, tucking the USB drive into his pocket and grabbing the stack of emails. It was time to move forward, one step at a time, and he wasn't going to look back. The workshop smelled faintly of damp concrete and sawdust, the kind of earthy scent that usually grounded Joseph. But tonight it felt suffocating. He sat at his workbench, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. Bank statements, text message printouts, and a crumpled grant application with Mark's name scrawled across the top. His fingers tapped a slow, uneven rhythm on the wood, like a clock ticking down to something inevitable. When he finally walked into the living room, Isabella was perched on the edge of the couch, scrolling through her phone, a half-empty glass of wine in her other hand. The cold, sterile light from the overhead fixture made her look almost unreal, like a mannequin propped up in a display window. She glanced up, her expression shifting from annoyance to irritation. "What now, Joseph?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he dropped the stack of papers onto the coffee table, the sound sharp and final. The wine glass in her hand wobbled, and for a moment, he thought she might drop it. Her eyes darted to the papers, then back to him, and he saw the flicker of something. Fear, maybe, or guilt, before she masked it with a scoff. "What's this? Your latest art project?" She leaned forward, her designer handbag sliding off the couch and hitting the floor with a dull thud. "It's not art," he said, his voice steady, though his hands were clenched into fists behind his back. "It's evidence." She laughed, that same dismissive laugh that had haunted him for years. "Evidence of what?" "Your paranoia." He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he pointed to the top sheet, a bank statement with a series of withdrawals highlighted in yellow. "You took $15,000 out of our savings last month. For what? Isabella? A new bag? Or was it for Mark?" Her smirk faltered, but she recovered quickly. "I told you that was for the grant work. Mark and I—" "Don't," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Don't lie to me. Not again." He flipped to the next page, a screenshot of a text exchange between her and Mark, time-stamped at 1:47 a.m. The words were blurred by the poor print quality, but the tone was unmistakable. Her face went pale, the color draining like water from a cracked vase. "Joseph, Stop," he said, cutting her off again. He didn't yell, didn't raise his voice, but the calmness of it seemed to unnerve her more than anger ever could. "I don't want to hear excuses. I don't want to hear lies. I just want the truth." She stared at him for a long moment, her lips trembling as if she were trying to summon the right words. Then, without warning, she burst into tears. The wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor, shards scattering like broken promises. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, black rivers carving through her carefully constructed facade. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." He didn't move, didn't reach out to comfort her. Instead, he stood there, watching as she crumbled, his expression unreadable. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time in years he felt in control. "Did you ever love me?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Of course I did. I still do." He shook his head, the weight of her words settling heavy in his chest. "No, you don't love me. You love what I gave you. Comfort, stability, a life where you didn't have to answer to anyone. But you never loved me." She opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "Don't. Just don't." For a long time, the only sound in the room was her muffled sobs and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He stood there, his resolve hardening with every passing second. The man who had once begged for her approval, who had let her belittle his art and his worth, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone who refused to be broken. Finally, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there amidst the shattered glass and tear-stained papers. He didn't look back. The day Joseph signed the divorce papers, the air in his workshop felt different, heavier, like the weight of wet concrete settling into a mold. He sat at his workbench, the signed petition resting beside a half-finished sculpture. The sculpture was rough, jagged, but it had started to take the shape of something defiant, something unbreakable. He ran his fingers over the edges, feeling the grit of the material beneath his calloused hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. Just like the savings account he'd locked down, just like the life he was rebuilding piece by piece. Isabella had tried to call him 3 times that morning. He'd ignored everyone. Her voice, once a melody he couldn't resist, now felt like nails scraping against chalkboard. He'd heard it all before. The apologies, the excuses, the tears that always seemed to dry up the moment she thought she had him back under her thumb. But not this time. This time, he'd made sure the safe in his workshop was bolted to the floor, his savings and important documents tucked away where she couldn't touch them. Even the key hung around his neck now, a small, cold weight against his chest that reminded him of the stakes. The lawyer had been clear. Isabella would try to fight for more. She always did. But Joseph had been meticulous. He'd printed every email, saved every text, documented every withdrawal she'd made without his knowledge. He'd even found the crumpled grant application Mark had signed, the one that had funneled money into her personal account. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about the years of her belittling his art, his dreams, his worth. He wasn't just protecting his savings. He was protecting the legacy of his work. Those sculptures weren't just pieces of concrete. They were pieces of him. As he sat there, the scent of dust and drying cement filling his lungs, he thought about the last time he'd seen her. It had been in the living room, the cold light from the overhead fixture making her face look almost ghostly. She'd laughed at him, called him paranoid, but he'd seen the flicker of panic in her eyes when he'd laid the evidence on the table. She hadn't expected him to fight back. She'd underestimated him. And now, as the divorce papers sat signed and ready to be filed, he allowed himself a small, bitter smile. She wouldn't underestimate him again. The workshop door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, his face a mix of worry and relief. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice soft, like he was afraid to break the fragile piece Joseph had carved out for himself. Joseph nodded, his hands still resting on the sculpture. "I'm getting there," he said, his voice steady. "It's not easy, but it's necessary." Ethan glanced at the divorce petition, then at the safe in the corner. "She's not going to like this," he said quietly. Joseph chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "She doesn't have to like it. She just has to live with it." The two of them sat in silence for a while, the sound of the workshop clock ticking away the minutes. Joseph's mind wandered to the new sculpture taking shape in front of him. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't smooth or polished or meant to please anyone. It was raw, unapologetic, and it felt like the truth, just like the life he was building now. As Ethan left, Joseph stood and walked over to the safe, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He already knew what was inside. His freedom, his future, and the unshakable knowledge that he'd finally taken control of his own story. And as he turned back to his workbench, his hands steady and his mind clear, he knew one thing for certain. Isabella had taken enough from him. She wouldn't take any more. The workshop smelled of damp earth and curing concrete, a scent that had always grounded Joseph, even when the world outside felt like it was crumbling. He stood in front of the new sculpture, his hands trembling slightly as they hovered over its surface. It wasn't perfect, it never was, but it was finished. A jagged, angular form rose from the base, its edges sharp and unyielding, yet softened by the faint curve of its silhouette. It looked like something that had been broken and then rebuilt, stronger than before. The sunlight streaming through the workshop window caught the sculpture's texture, casting long, intricate shadows across the floor. Joseph stepped back, wiping his hands on his apron. His palms were raw from hours of grinding and shaping, but the pain felt good. It was real. Unlike the hollow ache in his chest that had lingered for months, this pain had purpose. He traced a finger along the sculpture's ridge, feeling the rough grain of the concrete beneath his skin. It was cold and unfeeling, just like the material itself, but there was something alive in it, something that spoke of endurance. He thought about the nights he'd spent out here after the divorce papers were signed, working until his arms ached and his vision blurred. The workshop had become his sanctuary, a place where the chaos of his life couldn't reach him. Here, he wasn't the betrayed husband or the man who'd let himself be walked over for too long. Here, he was just an artist. The sculpture wasn't just a piece of art. It was a statement, a declaration that he wasn't broken, no matter how much Isabella had tried to chip away at him. He'd poured every ounce of his anger, his grief, his quiet determination into it. And now, standing in front of it, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. He glanced at the corner of the workshop where his old tools sat, dusty and forgotten. They'd been his father's once, passed down with the expectation that Joseph would use them to build something meaningful. For a long time he hadn't. He'd let Isabella's laughter, her dismissive comments about his pathetic attempts, silence him. But not anymore. He'd reclaimed this space, this part of himself, and no one could take it from him again. The sunlight shifted, and for a moment, the sculpture seemed to glow, its rough edges catching the light in a way that made it look almost fragile. Joseph's chest tightened. He thought about Ethan, about the way his son had quietly supported him through everything. He thought about the late-night conversations they'd had, the way Ethan had encouraged him to keep going, even when it felt like there was nothing left to fight for. He stepped back again, his eyes never leaving the sculpture. It wasn't just about resilience, he realized. It was about renewal, about building something new from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. He'd spent so much of his life trying to hold things together, trying to keep the peace, but now he saw the value in letting things fall apart, because only then could he rebuild them into something stronger. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He ignored it. For now, this moment was his. He took a deep breath, the smell of concrete and sweat filling his lungs, and for the first time in a long time he smiled. Not the tight, forced smile he'd worn for years, but a real one. The kind that came from knowing he'd survived. The kind that came from knowing he was finally free. The workshop smells like dust and wet concrete, the way it always does this time of year. Rain taps against the windows, steady and soft, like it's apologizing for something. I'm sitting at my workbench, my hands resting on the surface, still stained gray from the last sculpture. My journal's open in front of me, the pages half filled with messy scribbles. Words I've been trying to piece together for weeks. It's hard to write about this stuff without sounding like one of those self-help books Ethan keeps leaving on my coffee table. But here I am, trying anyway. On the wall across from me, there's a framed photo of Ethan and me from last summer. We're standing in front of the lake. Him grinning like he always does. Me looking like I just realized I forgot to turn off the oven. That kid's been my anchor through all of this. He's the one who pulled me aside that night, who told me what he'd seen, who gave me the courage to start digging. I don't know if I'll ever be able to thank him enough for that. Maybe that's why I keep the photo there, to remind me that not everything fell apart. The journal's open to a page where I've written, in all caps, "Never again." It's underlined 3 times like I was trying to carve it into the paper. I stare at it for a while, my fingers tapping against the bench. It's not just about Isabella. It's about the years I spent letting her chip away at me, piece by piece, until I didn't even recognize myself. I let her mock my sculptures, belittle my work, make me feel like I was nothing more than a paycheck and a warm body in the house. And for what? Because I thought that's what love was supposed to look like? Because I was afraid of being alone? I flip the page and start writing again. This time it's not about her. It's about me. About what I've learned. About the fact that no one gets to decide your worth but you. I write about the sculptures. How each one feels like a piece of me, solid and unbreakable, even when the world tries to crack them. I write about the nights I spent in this workshop, pouring concrete and rage into something beautiful, something that couldn't be taken away from me. And I write about the day I finally stood in front of Isabella with the evidence in my hands. How her tears didn't make me feel powerful or vindicated. Just tired. So damn tired. The rain picks up, hammering against the roof now. I close the journal and set it aside, my eyes drifting to the blueprint pinned to the wall. It's for a new sculpture, something bigger than anything I've ever tried before. A spiral, twisting upward, like it's reaching for something. I don't know if I'll ever finish it. Maybe that's the point, to keep reaching even when you're not sure where you're going. Ethan's coming over for dinner tonight. He's been doing that a lot lately, just showing up with a 6-pack and some takeout like he knows I need the company even if I won't admit it. I'll tell him about the new project, and he'll nod like he understands even though I know he doesn't. That's okay. He doesn't have to. I stand up and walk over to the photo, brushing a bit of dust off the frame. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm standing on solid ground. Not because of what I've lost, but because of what I've found myself. And no one, not Isabella, not anyone, gets to take that away from me again. Never again.